Good evening and welcome to the latest in Live Without Littlewood. This is the latest instalment in a series in which, much like the Terry Wogan show, a series of younger and more attractive substitutes step into the shoes of the wily old master and try, but don't quite succeed, to match the charisma of the man for whom the show is named. I've got a cracking lineup joining us tonight to discuss the good, the bad and the ugly of what's been happening in and around Westminster and around the world from a free market point of view. Delighted to be joined by IEA Energy Analyst and Chief Operating Officer Andy Mayer. I'll be asking him about how free marketeers should respond to the energy crisis. I'm going to talk to CapX editor John Ashmore, who'll be telling us more about how we can move the Overton window back in the right direction. And Emily Carver, the acting director of comms and head of media here at the IEA, will be telling us that we shouldn't avoid telling some economic truths just because it makes some people feel sad. But I'm delighted, first of all, to be joined by Christian Calgie, deputy editor of the Guido Fawkes blog. Thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you.
For what is, if people haven't gathered at home, one of the rainiest, monsoony days of the year so far. I'm really glad in this muggy humidity that you've come and joined us. Britain in crisis, energy, it would seem, energy price rises, strikes, NHS in turmoil. But the Prime Minister and the Leader of Opposition have been rather absent in recent weeks. Discuss.
Yeah, no, everything's going great, and everyone,
We've got just what we want.
everyone should calm down. No, it's really difficult times. I'm not sure really what a lot of people expected. I see a lot of people on the left in the anti-Boris media who have spent a year trying to remove the guy from power. He stood outside on the lectern warning that this was a dangerous time to remove the Prime Minister because we were facing so many national crises. And let's not forget the amount of people who were, agitating to have him removed immediately and install either Dominic Raab or a caretaker Prime Minister who would have frankly had no more authority, in the position as Boris does currently, and are now, wetting themselves at the current state of inertia that we see in government.
So I think, look, we are where we are, of course, and I think we've got to accept that anyone coming next to this role is going to have to accept they've got rather less authority than Boris Johnson, because he won a mandate at the general election and they didn't. But whoever does come into this role next is coming off the back of a series of strikes this month, rail, bus, tube strikes all this week, nationwide, and then Royal Mail employees strike next week, and port workers at Felixstowe, which is just really bad if you're thinking about the economy for the UK, dependent on imports as we are, will strike later this month. I mean, what should the next Prime Minister, what's the right approach to tackling this increasingly militant unionism?
Well, let's presume the next Prime Minister is going to be Liz Truss, right? Let's deal in the realm of reality here. I've been enthused at her view that she's going to try and be less presidential, because the reality is there are so many crises going on, there are so many plates spinning that no Prime Minister could try and take a grip of all of them. I've just been rereading about the Cameron years and thinking about the way he took control when there was flooding over in Cornwall. There's no way...
Put his wellies on and went down there.
Exactly. I mean, that was really one crisis at a time. Now there's one in almost every sector. It's too hot and it's too wet. There's water shortages and there's flooding. There's port strikes. There's strikes in every sector. There's cost of living, which is going to, if we listen to any of the proposed ideas coming out so far, it's going to cost billions. So what we need is we need a really strong cabinet. We need a Prime Minister who can properly delegate and not flinch and think, okay, I'm going to get myself involved here, because that will lead to disaster. The problem is we've got a new Prime Minister who's going to come in, they're going to sit behind the desk in 10 Downing Street, and they're going to think, I'm the most powerful person in the country and I'm going to lead on all these issues, and it's simply not going to be possible.
Yeah, it's not possible for two reasons. The first is you can't juggle that many balls at once, and secondly, mixing my metaphors, if you go into number 10 just thinking I just need to direct things, like Blair said at the end of his first term, I've spent my time energetically pulling levers, and then I realised that the levers weren't connected to anything. The hard-working government isn't making the decision, it's making sure the decision is implemented. It's doing the hard graft, not to quote a current leadership contender, the hard graft to make sure things actually happen.
Yeah, and I mean, in that point, I'd be very worried thinking about one of the things that has dominated this leadership contest. It may not seem that pressing to people out in the country, but it is very important, is the state of the civil service.
Yep.
And, I'd be very concerned if I were Rishi or Liz thinking about coming into Downing Street. I actually think the lack of control over various elements of government, whatever you think of Boris, I don't think enough has been moving at the right pace over the last few months. And I think the civil service, both with the refusal to come back to the office and also probably thinking Boris is going to be out so we can slack about like it's the last week of half term, they're going to have to really shake a leg and get back up to full speed here. And if they think they can continue at the sluggish pace they have in implementing what the government wants, then the whole country is going to car crash here.
Now, so what you just said about half term is very interesting to me, because I was recently on an inferior channel to the IEA's YouTube channel. It's called ITV, and it was put to me by someone who I think has slightly lost his head, but no politician should basically ever be able to have holidays. If you're in a crisis, then government should be there at all times. My view, when haven't we had a crisis in the last few years? I mean, should leaders be able to take holidays? Are they taking too many? Is the image of our Prime Minister on a beach at this time the wrong one to send? What's your perspective?
Well, I think the reality is neither the Prime Minister nor Nadhim Zahawi are in a position to implement any policies at the moment.
No.
There's just no point, because they don't know what the new Prime Minister is going to want to do. There's going to be a new Chancellor in 3 weeks who will set policy. Now, Nadhim Zahawi's in a more important position. He can get the Treasury to start thinking, look, this is what Rishi's proposing, this is what Liz is proposing, let's start thinking about how we can implement those to hit the ground running. Boris is more symbolic, right? I'm eternally peeved off that I'm not getting a holiday this summer purely for my own poor planning, but Boris, the Prime Minister of the 5th largest economy in the world, has been on 2 in 2 weeks. But, his is purely symbolic. There's no point really him being.
So you say that's very interesting, because of course this month, whilst I can see he's been away a lot, he's convened and met with the heads of the energy businesses in the midst of an energy crisis which is affecting our country like many, and he's reached the interim settlement on payment for the victims of the contaminated blood scandal, which is going to be profound for those who are affected by it. Indeed, that may be his last act in office. So, he does still have a kind of convening power, doesn't he?
Of course, yeah. The Prime Minister will always, and a phone call from the Prime Minister, whether he's in Downing Street or in Chequers, is going to get things.
Or for argument's sake, on a beach.
Or on a beach in Greece, exactly. It will get things done. But as I say, the reality is that once a Prime Minister has announced they're going to leave office, the power is sucked from the building. The reality is that civil servants are going to think, well, what's the point in doing X, because someone new is going to come in 3 weeks and potentially reverse that and do Y. So, they need to be thinking about the next stage. Really, that's what I would say. Yeah. Is they've got to be thinking about the next stage. And I also think, actually, we've got the leader of the opposition and a lot of opposition voices saying, well, the Prime Minister needs to put new economic support, policies in now. And I just ask, well, why? The bills haven't yet gone up. We haven't gone into the new price cap. We've already got a £400 handout up to £1,200 if you're in the lower households, ready for when the price cap goes up next. Yes, we need to be thinking about November and January when it's set to go up by more than anyone imagined, but the reality is those policies are already in place. It's not like we're going to crash the car anytime soon on that issue. Public sector,
we may crash it on others.
We may crash it on many other issues. Public sector pay, I believe, has already largely been preliminary agreed by departments in certain sectors. So things have already been put in place before Boris left. Preparation should be made now, but the left, the opposition, need to deal with the fact that removing a Prime Minister, knowing the process of a Tory leadership election was always going to take about a month and a half, 2 months, and all sorts of unnecessary hustings and debates. We were going to be rudderless for a long time, and they cheered when Boris left, and now they're realising maybe it wasn't a great time to celebrate getting rid of a Prime Minister.
It's great talking and listening to you. Stay with me, please. We're going to be joined by Emily Carver, IEA's Head of Media.
Thank you.
Hey.
Hello. Hi, Calgie.
Hello. Thank you very much for joining us. Emily, this point about, in office but not in power, what's your perspective?
Well, it has seemed for quite a while now that this country is ungovernable in some respects. The government may try to reform things, may try to bring in laws, and immediately we have various uprisings from public sector lobby, from different campaign groups, of course from the opposition, and it's very difficult for the government, although they're in power, to actually get things done. Now the hope is that somehow the Conservative Party, the government, will be reinvigorated by a new leader. I, like Calgie, perhaps am slightly sceptical of that. I've found the leadership contest quite tiresome in many respects. There have been plenty of policies put out there and then rescinded or watered down, and it seems to me that, I don't know if it's our social media age, I don't know if it's because there are just so many different crises that impact so many different people, so many different groups within our country, but it does seem like it's going to be very, very difficult for the government to get things done in such a short period of time.
So, devil's advocate, given that you set out positions that I think a lot of people will agree with about this frustrating process, isn't it a positive that people can rehearse policies, put them out into the public domain, realise they're going nowhere and pull them back? Isn't it better they do that now in leadership election than do it in government?
It depends why they're pulling back. Of course, it's very difficult. It's frustrating when a politician seems to believe in what they're saying. They put forward the case for a policy, and off the back of outrage, usually from social media and our broadcast media, and from, of course, the opposition, who will oppose most things, that immediately those policies are rescinded. And I don't know if that's the fact that the Conservative Party are underconfident in their appeal and in what they can do. They know that they're going to be facing a general election very soon. There's probably members of the Conservative Party MPs who are fearful of the next election, but it does seem to me that yes, testing policies is a great thing and rethinking policies, but why they're doing it, I think, is just as important.
Christian, how much of this is down to the rules that you were mentioning? You were saying the Labour Party should have anticipated. If you defenestrated Prime Minister, or indeed the Tory rebels might have anticipated.
Yes, exactly.
If you defenestrated Prime Minister, this is the process that is in place, at least for now. How much is that the cause of this, and how likely is that to be amended or changed?
I'd like to see it changed ahead of the next leadership election. I think we've got to look at this, especially given the rules were put in place in the 2000s when we were much less of we were still a 24-hour news cycle, but you think about the way that we're now a sort of hourly news cycle where a story comes and goes within half an hour, it blows up on social media. Does it mean everything? Does it mean nothing? I would suggest that actually, if we were to learn the next Prime Minister this Friday, there would be no extra intelligence gained from when we learned the Prime Minister on the 5th of September. I think the process is... The thing is, usually I would say, from a purely theoretical, ideological standpoint, this thing should stay in Parliament with MPs because they have a...
No members vote at all.
I don't think so, because they have a mandate. My problem is with this particular leadership election, I've had a peculiar experience because this is the first election where I've got to say my mind has been changed during the course of the election.
Oh, well, that demonstrates there's some virtue in the process.
Absolutely. I mean, I was at Liz Truss's leadership launch and I thought it was boring, I thought it was uncharismatic, and frankly, when she couldn't find the door to leave the room and I was caught on BBC News weeing myself with laughter with another journalist, I thought it was shambolic. And I thought she's very likely going to win, and I think she's going to be Theresa May times 20 in terms of how bad she is on the public stage. And yet she came out in the first husting, I think it was in Leeds, and I was absolutely shocked that it was the same woman. And I think, yes, she was battered around on the public sector pay bodies, But the way that she's held her own amongst the overwhelming opposition on announcing extra support in the form that's not, in handouts rather than tax cuts, the media have been relentless, the opposition have been relentless, Rishi Sunak's been relentless, and she has held her own. I think she's come out with some very interesting policies, many of which may have been germinated in or around these streets, in these buildings, who knows. But I'm much more enthused now about a Liz Truss premiership than I would have been had the thing concluded in Parliament only.
Fair enough. Emily, I want to take you back to the rules, because I think it's an interesting discussion about whether, given how frequently we're having these Tory leadership elections currently, and given that the Conservative Party's been in government for a very significant period of time, since we've had these rules with members voting, the Conservatives have had 6 leadership elections, including this one. So the average is every 3.5 years. That average is getting smaller, by the way, with leaders. Is this still the right format? I mean, there's a non-trivial amount of time now being taken up by leadership elections.
Yes, and I've been thinking about this. I've been giving this a bit of thought this afternoon, and I think that if I were voting, I would want there to be some changes. I think, for example, it should take longer to whittle down those first 2 candidates, and so that MPs actually have a chance to think about it for a longer stage, because they are presenting 2 candidates to their membership, and they hadn't even had a chance to say anything. I mean, if you cast your mind back, many of those candidates hadn't even got their, proposals ready or anything. But even their graphics, they hadn't even got ready.
Don't the MPs know their colleagues already, right? Isn't that the fundamental test?
Well, no, because that prevents, new and upcoming people from coming through. Yes, people will have their favourites, but I think, for example, Kemi Badenoch, she managed to get star status for a while, but then obviously MPs didn't listen to the membership who were pro-Kemi at that time. She was leading in terms of where the membership was. I think something could be changed in that respect. I do think, despite the fact that people like you may have changed their mind over the course of events, I do think
not many people do they?
At this moment of time, it does seem far too long, this process, in my mind, and I think in a lot of people's mind. And let's remember, this is a spectator sport for the vast majority of the public who just have to watch while 100,000 Tories, who they mostly consider to be, old farts, choosing to their next Prime Minister. And I think that's not necessarily the best thing for democracy. I do understand that's how this goes. Yeah. But it must be very frustrating, while at the same time, I think Boris Johnson probably should have been able to be on the ballot.
Yeah, 160,000 old farts, Emily.
Seeing as he got 40 million votes.
50. Right. But I do have
but that's the perception. That's the public perception.
I hear you. Although, actually, interestingly, I think leadership elections are quite a recruiting sergeant for people to join political parties. And given how frequently we're having them now, presumably membership's going to spike, right? If you want to say in this process, join the Tory party.
We still don't know.
I mean, that's the main, that's the prize of being a member of a party.
Which is an increasingly recurring prize.
Yes.
Yes. Well, it's of course the other point about the Tories is they've got to offer the membership something. And unlike the Labour Party, which gives members a voice over very theoretical voice on policy at party conferences, the Tories are, the moment a leader is elected, the Tories don't get, the membership don't really get a say in it until the next time it comes around. Policy is decided in cabinet, it's dictated to them at conference and, in manifestos, and that's the only time they get a say. So the Tories, if they took it away from the membership, would have to think very carefully about what, membership is a huge source of funding for political parties, and if members don't get to decide on the leader, then what on earth is the incentive to be a member of the party?
I imagine there is a level of apathy among some Conservative members, particularly those who wanted Boris to be on the ballot and those who have yet to be excited by either candidate.
Is it ignorance or apathy? I don't know, and I don't care.
Ignorance.
I want you to like and comment and subscribe to the IEA's YouTube channel, and I want you to support our digital comment through Patreon. Most importantly, right now, you're watching this, click that like button, hit that subscribe button. We're going to be very grateful. And we're going to be joined in the course of this fantastic chat by the IEA's Chief Operating Officer and Energy Analyst, Andy Mayer. Andy, great to have you with us. Keir Starmer, what a week. Returns from holiday, big up, the big Starmer, plan to keep the energy cap at current levels, a mere 30 billion commitment. I'm sure it came to him on his holiday. 6 months, 30 billion, sounds like a bargain, doesn't it?
Well, 30 billion for now.
Yeah, for now.
And it must be a joy for the Labour Party that having ditched Corbyn, they now have a leader once again who has rediscovered hardcore militant socialism. Someone who believes that it is not only the role of the state to help and protect the vulnerable, but to protect energy executives with 2 swimming pools to run from the consequences of running those swimming pools, because that's what the Labour proposal will do.
So Starmer has implied that this would last for as long as a year, which would cost as much as furlough did, which is something that happens in a once-in-a-lifetime national crisis, extraordinary measures, the kind of thing we don't normally see in peacetime. What happens at the end of that time?
What you will find is what previous governments in the post-war period found is that price controls, once tried, are really hard to ditch. And this was the warning organisations like the IEA sent the May administration when they first flirted with the idea of the energy price cap, which, to be clear, isn't really an energy price cap, it's an energy price delay. But what Labour are now proposing is a price cap. And a price cap that says, let's make believe with prices, let's pretend that costs aren't really rising across the world, that there isn't really an energy crisis going on. We can shield the entire population, the domestic population, not businesses, from the consequences of that. And several things will happen. The first thing that will happen is that everybody else say, well, if that's important, then why not us? So small businesses are already calling for an equivalent of the energy price cap because they have the same sort of case.
So, Christian, let's bring you in, because without some kind of support, it looks like household bills are going to jump 2-3 times over the next year. We've seen estimates of £4,300 in January. What's the free market alternative here?
Well, I'm going to leave, specific policy thinking to my superiors at the IEA and other excellent think tanks. But the other thing I'd say is, look, we are talking about the sort of scale of this Labour, energy freeze because of the Overton window that Rishi Sunak created when he brought in furlough, right? Rishi Sunak became Chancellor and about a week later had to present a budget, and however many weeks, 2 weeks later had to lock down the whole economy and introduce furlough. Now, I would suggest that between now and November, we probably have enough time to think of a more refined way of providing support to people who actually need it, rather than spending, whatever percentage, tens of billions on people who, can definitely afford, a substantial energy bill increase. They may not be able to go skiing in December. They may not be able to go to the Maldives this summer. They may have to start shopping in Tesco's rather than Waitrose. But, plenty of people, if they cut back, will be able to, face this energy crisis over the winter without the state having to borrow tens of billions of quid to support them. And that is my main objection to Starmer's policy.
Yeah.
Is that your position too, Emily, that households should basically realise the economic realities of this, suck it up, cut back on other things and pay their energy bills?
Yes, I mean, the lockdown and the furlough payments have all been a hostage to fortune for the Conservatives, because now there is an assumption that the state can solve all our problems, and the harsh reality, which is not going to be communicated to us, is that people are going to have to spend less. And that is concerning, because that also means that businesses are going to fall under. So all of these businesses, we're already seeing insolvencies go up rapidly in various sectors. Businesses are going to go under. Now, we've spoken about how this recession may be job rich, because the labour market stats are still looking pretty good. But if these businesses continue to fall under, and they will if people aren't going out and spending as they were, because they need to, look after the pennies, then we're going to be in a very difficult situation where we are in a full-blown recession and people are going to lose jobs as well. But the Labour Party are being extremely dishonest when they seem to assume that they can just put price controls in place and everything will be hunky-dory, that the taxpayer is somehow going to find tens of billions and billions. We were told that the packages we all received during lockdown were a one-off measure, and that it would keep us all afloat and we'd be able to continue after lockdown. That hasn't been the case. And, there are going to be endless calls for more money.
Well, the problem with one-off measures is that they're increasingly addictive.
Exactly. It's like we're addicted to handouts, essentially.
Because I think there is an argument to be had amongst your excellent remarks about whether actually some businesses which have been addicted to cheap debts to keep going, in an unproductive way. This is the kind of thinking that gets Tory candidates dismissed. But there was one chap who, under Michael Howard, referred to creative destruction and was immediately off the candidates list. Don't worry, he's now an MP. But I simply point out that economics might have something to say about businesses going to the wall in a slightly more challenging time, because it's very unproductive to have people in jobs that aren't going anywhere. But Emily, you were implying that the state doesn't have all of the answers, which is of course something one can accept. Andy, I can't help but notice that you have recently been discussing a policy about cutting the prices of fuel by cutting fuel duty by half or more than half. Just tell us about that.
So this is 44p off the pump price to match a 44% rise in motor fuel inflation in the last year. And that would not just help households and individuals getting to work, that also help the small businesses who have to transport goods to and from their customers and from their suppliers. And where that breaks down is you cut fuel duty from 53p down to 20p. You leave some tax there because it's a carbon tax, effectively. So it's got to be an environmental signal. When you do that, you also take another 11p off, because for bizarre reasons the government applies VAT to fuel duty. There is double taxation.
It's tax on a tax.
Tax on tax. So 44 for 44. That would give households £650 off the cost of living for the next 7 months at the end of the financial year.
And what's the cost?
Cost would be about 11.5 billion.
Well, that seems a fraction of what people are throwing around at the moment. That's certainly a fraction of what Starmer is proposing in his activities for a 6-month period. So that's saying, on the one hand, that sounds great. On the other hand, are you ready for the greenies to come at you and saying you're making it cheaper to put fuel in your car and therefore you're the devil and will take us all to hell?
The green argument is this: to correctly signal climate change and its social costs, you need consistent carbon taxation, not just within the economy, but with our near and dearest competitive rivals. The fuel duty, if it were a carbon tax alone, is about 3 times as much as the carbon tax that's buried in your power bills.
Christian, Andy, as he says it, sounds very reasonable. You're a man of the people. Let's imagine now that instead of being here in the lovely IEA studios dryly discussing tax policy, we're there on the picket line, perhaps in Scotland at a hustings. People are egging you. They're saying, why do you want the world to burn? Why do you hate my children? Do you think this policy is going to fly?
Well, the answer to both those questions is yes. But I think, fuel duty is one of those difficult things, because we saw Rishi take, was it 5p off fuel duty? And firstly, it didn't really touch the sides, given the total, bill that you pay at the pump. Yeah. But also, there are also a broader question, of course, how do you enforce the entirety of that being passed on to consumers and not being sucked up by petrol stations? Might be another concern for please have that.
This is a misconception. There are about 8,500 retail fuel stations across the United Kingdom. It is a competitive market. Clearly there are isolated places where you've only got one option, where you will see higher fuel bills. But in the main, it's a competitive market where margins in the retail sector are kept very low, usually single digits, been a little higher from volatility lately, but it's not a business where you can really accuse them of price gouging. All the profit is occurring in the supply side. It's people digging oil and gas out of the ground, people refining it, and this is a direct consequence of what the governments across Europe, and to a lesser extent the United States, have been doing, which is telling the industry we don't want you anymore.
So Emily, Andy's admirably details-oriented. There's a reason he's your Chief Operating Officer. Your big picture and strategy, let's take it back to a different level. Free marketeers, of course, want to have international trade and so forth. But what do we do about preventing this situation from happening again? I mean, what do we do from making sure that we don't have another crash if there's an international event? And what do we do about energy independence?
Well, we can't control, in terms of energy, in terms of gas supply, we can't control when there are going to be external shocks. Of course we can't, and we can't control the wholesale costs of oil and gas. But what we could have been better prepared for, but this also is a question for Europe as a whole. Europe was far too dependent on Russia for far too long, and they were warned that they were by horrible Donald Trump, remember? And others, of course, but they continued to be so. Now we're facing the consequences of that. On this side, and this is something that Andy bangs on about all the time, is that we haven't invested enough in our domestic supply, and that net zero policy has often prioritised decarbonisation and arbitrary targets over security and affordability of supply. So there's the fracking, there's the North Sea oil exploration we should be doing more of, but we can't prevent Putin from turning off the taps.
And of course, it's not just supply, it's also storage, isn't it, Andy? Rough's reopened, discuss.
Okay, well, just before that, I mean, you as a fan of stories from World War II will love what actually happened in the oil industry during the war. Roughnecks from Texas came over, about 300 of them, and secretly worked from the British government in forests across the country, drilling oil wells so that we were not so vulnerable to the German war machine sinking ships that were otherwise...
Just go somewhere and drill a hole straight down.
Yeah, so, I mean, if you want to fight Vladimir Putin, well, the position we should be in now is exporting our oil and gas into Europe so that Germany is not beholden.
Enormous wealth beneath our feet, if only we were to frack, for example. Christian?
Well, let's also talk about nimbyism as the cause of almost every problem this country has faced for the last decade. I literally have nightmares thinking about that Nick Clegg clip from 2010 saying there's no point doing new nuclear power stations because they won't come online until 2022. The vitriolic hate I have for that man and the Liberal Democrats, who not only have opposed every new energy development, whether it be fracking or local onshore wind turbines or nuclear energy, whether it be complaining about water shortages and then blocking a new water development in Oxfordshire. People like Layla Moran make me sick, and the fact is that whether the Tories have been in power, most power really relies with local residents who can block anything because they don't want to see a wind turbine, or they want to look over an open field from their house that's just gone over £1 million because no new ones are being built. And the same goes for energy. And frankly, NIMBYs have brought this all on themselves, and they deserve everything that's happening to this country.
Well, what a set of remarks. Rather than having you on the set for a couple more minutes, I'm going to allow that to be your epitaph with us. That was absolutely fantastic. Christian's going to leave us, and we're going to... I could tap dance for you, I could sing, and if the reviews are good enough, I will do next time I'm hosting for you. But in the meantime, all I'm going to do is ask you to hit that subscribe button, and consider contributing to support this kind of content at the IEA. And I'm going to ask you all, please, to welcome CapX editor John Ashmore, who's going to join us stage right as soon as he's mic'd up. We're going to be talking energy, we're going to be talking the crisis in politics in the UK, the Overton window, the next 20 minutes on Live Without Littlewood. And in the meantime, do take a moment to drop us a comment too, please, bearing in mind that you're live commenting now and can comment on YouTube full time later. John, great to have you with us. Thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
A rose between two IEA thorns.
I know.
We've been kicking around energy. You've been able to listen to some of that. What's your take?
I mean, I agree with much of what's been said already, especially the stuff about the price freeze. I mean, this is sort of fantasy economics. And we ran a piece on CapX this week from Julian Jessup, who is a fellow at the IEA, just pointing out that the line he said was that it's good politics, but lousy economics. And it's also selling people an idea that you can just kind of game the rules somehow in this way. And it's sort of, I hate to use these kind of, it sounds hyperbolic, but it is the kind of Soviet-style economics. If you fix a price, suddenly it goes away, but that's not how it works. I share everyone's concerns. I think that one thing that we're not talking about enough is the cost of energy to businesses. We talk a lot about households, we talk about employment being high. If you're running, for example, a restaurant, say, I was reading a story earlier today. It's a guy who owns a curry house somewhere in the Midlands, I think, and he was saying, my energy bill has tripled. It's gone from £1,000 to £3,000 a month. And you think...
Well, it's the difference between staying up and going under, isn't it?
Well, exactly. These aren't, it's particularly in hospitality, margins are pretty fine. A lot of these places run on 5-10% or less. And, that's just an individual. Perhaps some of the bigger companies, your McDonald's or Greggs or whatever, can bear that kind of thing. Independent businesses can't. I just fear that we're heading for a kind of a crunch of unemployment going up, household spending going down, energy bills going up, a kind of perfect storm.
Emily?
But it's one of those things that's very frustrating, and this is something about trust in government, because there were things businesses could have invested in order to make themselves less at risk when it came to energy costs. You know, a lot of the big corporates have been investing in energy efficiency measures in their warehouses, in their factories, in their front-facing outlets, whatever, for years. But, you know, I just think businesses weren't told early enough just the risks that they may well be facing and just how high these energy costs would go. And I know the government doesn't know from years and years in advance, but I do think that there is an absence of communication and we're sort of just left to pick up the pieces.
Andy, before we move on from energy, as the resident energy analyst, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't underestimate that these higher energy prices are the direct consequence of what the government actually wanted. They didn't want this, but what they wanted was energy prices to be high enough to incentivise and accelerate the transition to net zero. And they are reaping the whirlwind as a consequence. There simply isn't the preparation in place to get us out of this fast. We can't accelerate fracking tomorrow. We can do it in 1 to 3 years. We can't accelerate the North Sea development fast. It could take even longer than that. But we desperately need to. Otherwise, we will be reliant on imports, because we simply cannot replace these energy sources with renewables fast enough.
Is that because, I mean, Christian's magnificent diatribe, which will stay with me for some time, but it was quite striking about Nick Clegg saying in 2010 no more nuclear because it won't come on stream until 2022. Do we still have that kind of short-term thinking in the sector?
We don't, but unfortunately we've got almost a worse problem, which is a rather too cosy relationship between corporations in the nuclear industry and the government.
Right.
There's a good nuclear industry which is competitive, innovative, and will provide solutions in the long term, but they're still going to take about 5 to 10 years minimum to deploy, so not a solution for tomorrow. And there's this sclerotic state corporation called EDF that's been bailed out and nationalised by the French government in the middle of suing the French government, putting a price cap on it, that has produced a technology that doesn't work. It's rusting away, the prototypes, and we're planning ahead with possibly putting 64 to 120 billion pounds into the first prototype, Hinkley Point, and about half that into the second at Sizewell. It's going to be a complete disaster that will increase the cost of living long term.
Well, let's leave energy with that rosy picture that you happily paint of an optimistic future. And Emily, say that the response to Keir Starmer's plan that we've just been discussing from some quarters has been, this doesn't go far enough. I mean, has the COVID period made people kind of unrealistic about what they expect the state to do for them?
Absolutely, and it's completely understandable.
Yeah.
I mean, people were paid, near full salary to sit at home for however many months it was. Of course, some people were working through the pandemic, of course, but a lot of people were on furlough, a lot of people working from home on near full pay. But I do think that the Conservatives, if they are to stay in government, do need to be bold in the way that they communicate their alternative. Yes, that means delivering some harsh truths. It must be very frustrating for those in government to listen to the Labour Party give out these proposals that are, as you said, fantasy economics. The public to praise those proposals, such as the price cap. You know, you look at that YouGov survey, that Snap poll that said, the vast majority of people would, funnily enough, support a freeze on their energy bills.
Yeah.
Who would opt in for high energy bills? No one. But it's so simplified. I don't know if that's just how our political debate is, whether we're all a bit stupid now, not so well educated that we can't understand trade-offs.
Do you think that people don't realise the connection between the state giving, inverted commas, you more, and the state taxing you more?
I think that a lot of it's funny because the left-wing press and broadcast and many very sensible commentators as well have likened tax cuts to handouts. Apparently they are the same thing now. So keeping more of your own money is the equivalent of being given a benefit, which is just ludicrous, and it's very frustrating. But this is how the left wins, because they manipulate language so well. And it's so easy to be left-wing. All you have to say is, oh, let's just put more money into that.
Give more tax.
That's literally the whole ideology from what I can see at the moment, from Keir Starmer anyway.
And John, is the success of that narrative really preventing serious discussion of these serious problems?
Well, I agree with much of what Emily said. I think that we've become inured to extremely high spending because of the last 2 years. And like you say, it's the idea that any extreme situation can be solved by that. I think there's a difficulty in that. I've said this before on this show actually, that kind of conservative or free market economics is not very intuitive to a lot of people. It's not necessarily just about trade-offs, it's about thinking through sort of several steps of things. So if you say to someone, we ought to cut taxes on big businesses, they will go, well, why would I want to pay for one of, I think Andy said earlier, the CEO's swimming pool? Why would I want to do that? It's not intuitive to the average person that results in higher wages for people at the bottom of the corporation or something like that. So I think there is this problem of messaging, and also I think often perhaps people on the right fail to engage in a sort of story about why these things are necessary. I think that was actually, if you look back at sort of the coalition years, for example, I think they told a simple, quite compelling narrative about why they were doing the things they were doing. And people actually, I think, did understand that to a degree. They said, look, we've got a big deficit. You wouldn't run your house like this. I know it's not, I don't like the credit card analogy much myself.
It worked,
but people
though.
understand it.
It worked.
And I think the government hasn't really communicated. I'm not even really sure what Boris Johnson's economic philosophy is, so it's pretty difficult to communicate something that you don't have. But
Andy, we've got an opportunity now to reset with a new leader. What's your take?
Okay, well, just to finish on that point, we can overstate how difficult it is to communicate free market ideas because we conflate push polls and single issue polls with the view of the public. And it's very easy to get a 75% approval rating for an idea that essentially says you can have free stuff and there are no consequences, clearly. Yeah. But when you start talking to people about wanting to keep more of your own money, now, do you care about your children being able to buy a house? You can start addressing issues like high taxes and nimbyism. For the new leader, well, they've got to hit the ground running. That first week of September is going to be absolutely crucial to their credibility. If they come in rather like Boris and sit there looking rather too happy and smug with the idea of power, that they are simply there to appreciate and bathe in the worship of their voters, then they're going to be in trouble very quickly and the Conservatives will lose the next election. If, on the other hand, they come out with a fully costed, concrete plan to deal with the cost of living crisis, then they have a fighting chance of persuading people that they are better and wiser stewards of the economy and people's interests going forward into that election.
Emily, how much are these candidates incentivised to do what Andy just said, to think seriously and to put forward serious ideas? I mean, Liz Truss has been through a difficult 24 hours because of remarks she said about people needing to graft more, which might be thought to be a blunt observation about our productivity problem, a widely acknowledged economic issue in this country for more than a decade. And she would be well advised by many kind of pure play pollsters and PRs to go neutral and be more vanilla and to talk about those things less. I mean, how much do we incentivise our leaders to take on the serious issues?
Well, I think you've either got to commit to being a no-nonsense, I'm going to say it like it is, politician, or you end up in that trap where you're scared to say anything. Yeah. And I do think it is that social media. And, I saw a tweet by some campaign group against the cost of living crisis. I think that's what they call themselves. Enough is enough. So they say, oh, Liz Truss has said workers just need to graft more. And then they say, what about the teachers and the nurses and the chimney sweeps and everyone else who grafts every day, how awful this is from this horrible Tory. And yes, you could say that this leaked video from God knows how long ago may not be, as polite or helpful or, accurate for absolutely everyone in this country. But it's what she believed. Productivity is an issue. The facts are some people don't work hard and some people do. Some people are happy to sit at home and do the bare minimum. Some people are going to go the extra mile. That's just a fact of life. And if there are more people now being lazier because of the pandemic, then that may be true. I think it probably is true. I think it's probably true in parts of our civil service, that's for sure, but also in businesses as well, because people have been less accountable for a long time. But yes, politicians should be able to say what they think. Unfortunately, they can't with our current setup.
Andy, you wanted to come back in?
Yeah, I think there's two things here. The audio recording itself, how seriously we should take a doctored audio tape that The Guardian have pushed out, probably from a civil servant who clearly works hard, but works hard at being unprofessional, breaching their duty as a public servant. Not very. On the productivity question itself, Well, Liz is wrong. It's not just a graft issue. Productivity is about working smarter, not longer hours, and the general trend in hours across the most productive countries is going down. We have a specific problem in this country. We have a problem rooted, as John said earlier, in nimbyism. If you make the cost of land go up and up and up, you can't build new ventures and locations. If you have an economy that's overly exposed to financial services, when you have a financial crisis, what a surprise, you're more exposed to productivity falling than other countries. When you decide to invest in energy, which is intermittent and inefficient when you've already got stuff that works, that's going to reduce productivity. So what Liz should be focusing on, or Rishi if he wins, is making sure that there's a clear plan for improving productivity rooted in reality, not making specious statements about protecting the green belt and nothing ever changing.
Well, we've given that a good airing. Emily, thank you so much for being with us. You're going to slip off. Gents are going to move up so I don't feel lonely down this end of the sofa. And thank you very much, Emily. And John, I'm going to ask you this, given what we've always described in the Overton window as you shuffle. It doesn't, what we've just been raking through the coals on, demonstrate a general kind of shift in policy terms to the political left in this country?
Absolutely. I think I referred earlier to the coalition government and their messaging. If we think back then, we were splitting hairs over really quite small amounts of public spending.
Yep.
People had this impression they were slashing the state, but actually it wasn't really the case. We were cutting about 1% a year, I think, of public spending most of those years. But now we're talking in terms of hundreds of billions of pounds. You know, people talk about a COVID-style response to the energy crisis, kind of as if it's nothing, as if it's just a done thing. It's like, yeah, let's just spend 50 billion quid on something. And it might be that you can make an argument that that's necessary to protect certain people from really what could be fatal increases in their bills. But I think we've just become quite kind of blithe about sticking it on the credit card, particularly because we had such low interest rates for such a long time. We go, oh, borrowing's effectively free, but that is no longer the case. Interest rates are starting to go up. So I think, hopefully, if nothing else, the reality of this winter will force people to think, we cannot keep on going in this vein forever. There will come a point where we have to stop. I am concerned that, as you say, the Overton window has definitely shifted to the left. I'm just glad Jeremy Corbyn's not around anymore to sort of take advantage of it.
Andy, we always hear in politics people saying this can't go on, and it turns out, generally speaking, it can. You can stagger on and systems can get worse and more money can be spent and debt can pile up more and the money you spend on servicing that debt goes up. But generally speaking, when people say the status quo is not sustainable, it turns out it sort of can be.
Well, the last time we were in a position anything like this one, we ended up with the energy crisis in the 1970s. There were concerns about strikes. The IMF ended up bailing out the country. Twice, yeah. So at that point, it really couldn't go on. The case for change was made by external intervention. And I think the leader of the opposition and both of the candidates are dreaming if they think it's going to be business as usual. And I don't think that is the case. I'm not sure about the opposition, but I think both Conservative candidates recognise the problem. The only question is whether they've got the steel in their spines to do what Margaret Thatcher did and challenge the cosy consensus that's built up around the British state that you can simply keep bailing people out with other people's money. I mean, it's clearly not going to happen. The Overton window may have moved to the left.
But not that far.
Not that far, and in a sort of crap and casual way under the Johnson administration.
Sure.
I think there's something slightly different to the Thatcher thing. She had clear, if you like, political enemies that had besieged the Tory party before, the mining unions and so on. And she basically learnt from the Heath government. She was like, I'm not going to repeat their mistakes. I think the problem the next Prime Minister faces is that they have to take on quite a lot of their own voters. If they're going to take on, we've talked about nimbyism quite a lot, and I do think it is the kind of, I wrote a piece on the weekend, I think it's the hob on which all the other boiling frogs of British policy sit. All these long-term problems that are getting worse and worse revolve around the fact that basically people can just turn stuff down if it's in their area and they don't like it. And at some point, a politician is going to have to come along and say, we can't carry on like this. And I think Christian mentioned the Abingdon Reservoir earlier. It's one of the few things where I'm normally a bit of a localist, but on this I think there is a piece of legislation called the Planning Act 2008, which entitles the government to call it in and just say we can build this. And we don't care what Layla Moran thinks. frankly, one of the most dangerous MPs in Britain in terms of denial of any houses anywhere in Oxford or anything, any infrastructure anywhere in the centre of the country. Sorry, Andy, you want to come in?
Yeah, I don't wish to defend the Liberal Democrats because they're
Excellent.
just as bad as everybody else. I mean, what's the difference?
It's not just the Left Dems, it's loads of Tories.
What's the difference between Layla Moran and Michael Gove, who given the opportunity in the last month or so to get onshore drilling off the ground without fracking?
But this is the point I'm making about taking on their own.
Only approved one of them.
Yeah, no, they need to take on their own side as well. It's not just...
Andy, the other question about that is not just the Tories confronting their own voters about things like nimbyism, it's about confronting issues currently very popular with the voters as a whole, because polling shows, Survation polled, how do you fancy nationalising this then? And it turned out a majority of the electorate's up for everything, right? So a majority of the electorate thinks energy, yes, rail, yes, buses, yes, water companies, yes, Royal Mail, yes, the state should own everything.
And if you ask that question attached to the cost of doing so how much would you be prepared to pay to buy BP? It's a push poll, isn't it? Then it's going to get a very different result. So people like the idea of nationalisation. It suggests that somebody can do something.
You've got more trust. This is very reassuring. You have got more trust in the electorate than people might generally look at research from the results of that poll and say, because you think it's because they've been asked the wrong questions.
Well, I've got more distrust in the polling industry as a former pollster.
Right, well, that's a nuance for you, but one I like.
I'll jump in. I don't think anyone's going to mistake Live Without Littlewood or with Littlewood as a chapter of the Tony Blair fan club, but I
cited him approvingly before you joined us on the set.
But he did say one thing about nationalisation. He was talking about the railways, and it really stuck with me. I think it's quite an acute analysis. He said, and it goes something like this: there's a 30-second conversation, the 3-minute conversation. 5 seconds, 5 minutes, and 30 minutes or something like that. So the 30 seconds is, do you want your trains to run faster and be cheaper? And everyone goes, yeah, brilliant. And if you stick that next to nationalisation, they'll go, yeah, brilliant. The 3-minute ones, actually this might cost a bit more and might involve your taxes going up. Then people, and this goes back to what Andy was saying earlier about the way that when this frame free market debate, so you have to talk a bit more about costs and demerits of policies as well. I think that nationalisation in a lot of these polling is basically just people voicing frustration at the fact that a lot of things don't work. They're not particularly ideologically bothered, right, as long as it works.
Andy, doesn't John's excellent point restate or underline the need for us in the free market to have our arguments ready? And someone once asked Churchill, how long does it take you to prepare for a 10-minute speech? And he said an hour. And they would look rather disappointed and say, well, how long does it take you to prepare for an hour-long speech? And he said, I'm ready now. Right? If you're going to deliver something honed and prepared, you've really got to get that right. And are we outside of the ivory towers of think tank land?
Well, do you want Angela Rayner running a nuclear power plant? If the answer is yes, you support nationalisation. I do not. I also don't think that nationalisation works. Bulb was nationalised. It was one of the retail energy companies. And it left all the same people in charge.
Smart though that line is, doesn't it cut both ways? Because I might also use that fear about Angela Rayner controlling something as an argument against building it. After all, she can't control the power station if I don't allow it to be built.
Well, true, but that really is a different argument. I mean, the nimbyism argument, which is really about what you allow being built next to you, not what you allow being built generally, is one where all politicians overestimate local opposition by focusing on a noisy few. There's no difference really between Extinction Rebellion and their noisy little protests in the centre of cities or on motorways and Tory or resident association-based local activists who demand the right to decide to block absolutely everything everywhere.
John, why have we, it's still recoverable, but why have we lost this argument about nuclear especially for so long in this country and failed to invest?
It's a few things. I think it's just the word nuclear that people associate with mass destruction, so they think...
That's bad branding, isn't it? Yeah.
It's bad branding. Yeah. Chernobyl, one of the most misunderstood of events probably in human history. Obviously not a good thing, but I think there's quite a lot of myths about it.
Suboptimal.
Suboptimal, I think you agree. 3 Mile Island, ditto. Yeah. I actually think that no one is more responsible for misleading the public on nuclear than Homer Simpson and whoever did the opening title credits. Most of our impressions in pop culture about the nuclear industry are one bald idiot away from meltdown. The nuclear industry is built to incredible. The reason it's so expensive is that it's incredibly safe. I mean, Andy's more of an expert on energy. My dad's a safety engineer, and there's a concept in engineering called inherent safety, which is crucial to the nuclear industry. It's basically nigh on impossible for those kind of events to happen, but they don't do a great job of getting the public to know this. So they just think there's also this impression that there's loads of nuclear waste, like kind of slurry coming out of nuclear plants, which is miles off the truth. So
of course,
there's a huge PR campaign that's needed on nuclear. You can make the kind of green arguments about decarbonisation, fine, but that doesn't really address most people's misgivings about it. And I think that, we need a huge campaign on that.
Andy, John is very compelling about this need to change people's minds. Do we just need to keep resorting and reverting to the battle of ideas? Do we need to do innovative things like taking lots of tax off of those people who have a station near them, or indeed pay people's energy bills and perhaps even pay them net to be living near reactors and so forth?
So I'm a bit of a cynic on 2 points. One is the idea that any building anywhere can ever be popular enough to just get people to wave it through. I mean, what is the form of energy next door to you that's popular? It's not biomass, it's not fracking, it's not gas power,
it's not energy from waste.
And it goes on, it's certainly not nuclear, solar or wind. But the free market idea that this is just a price problem, that if we just increase the incentives, then people will eventually overcome their resistance and allow something to build. There is something in that, but at some point it isn't true, because people greatly overvalue an empty field next to them compared to what the benefit will be to the entire country. So there is a huge market failure problem as well in that. So at some point the government has said what is local matters, but it don't matter that much, and you've got to build stuff. And if the government is serious in their net zero intention, what they're really talking about is about 10 to 15% of the UK's land area being swept up with solar farms and wind farms. I don't actually believe they do believe that.
Say that again. If we didn't add other stuff, nuclear and so forth, if we were serious about our renewable commitment, you're saying 10 to 15% of the whole of Britain's land mass will be covered in solar panels.
And that's also including about 15 to 20% of the offshore area.
And presumably that involves quite a lot of mining somewhere in the world to
Oh yes, but the government don't worry about anything offshore.
Yeah, there's no other.
That's somebody else's problem, or it's a problem for future Homer, as your Simpsons analogy might.
Yeah, I'm quite worried about reports I've seen in Chile, which is, I think, is the world's largest copper producer. It's one of the world's largest.
There aren't enough rare earth minerals.
Yeah. Although I gather the Turks just found an enormous new deposit which may change the economics of that somewhat.
But this is the way markets should work, as in there is increasing demand for renewable and green tech.
Yeah.
That will increase demand for different kinds of resources and technology. That will then emerge through the usual process of supply and demand through the trade system, and it will happen gradually, it will happen at a pace that we can actually cope with. What you can't do is sit in number 10 and say, by 2050, the UK will be net zero. I command it so, and the Prime Minister issued a tweet yesterday saying 10,000 days to go. Well, how does he know? He doesn't know what's going to happen with world technology. He can't predict what's going to be happening next week, let alone in 10,000 days' time. And he certainly can't predict what's happening globally with huge supply chains, which are what are going to deliver the technology change. So in the long run, the green activists are correct. We are going to a net zero future, and hooray for that. Even if you don't agree on climate change, having a system which is based on not polluting the air and breathing in other things that we don't like in our lungs is a good thing. But what you can't do is century plan it. It's the same argument that we use against every other form of central planning, and the government and the Conservatives have gone mad as much as the opposition have on this.
John, there's something to be taken away from that that's quite optimistic, actually, about the positive outcome, even if people have got the messaging wrong right now and the thinking wrong right now. So, last word to you. Do you go along with that?
I do, to a degree. My fear is that we're being unrealistic about how painful the transition is going to be from the world we're in now to one where we primarily use renewables instead of hydrocarbons. If we think about what that's going to look like in the UK, we're talking about banning petrol cars, we're talking about lots of things like replacing boilers that are going to be very expensive for a lot of households. When other countries look at us, are they necessarily going to think this is a road I want to go down if it looks expensive to them? My concern is that the statist instincts that you described earlier, the Overton window shifting leftwards, all kind of militate against the kind of market-led process which Andy has described so well, actually happening in an efficient fashion. So I'm optimistic in the sense that, in a general sense, about the innovative capacity of human beings and scientists and so on. I'm much less optimistic about the way politicians will manage that process.
Well, thank you both very much, and thanks to my other panellists who were with us and have now just slipped into the audience to give us wild and rapturous applause with the rest, as I thank my panel and thank everyone that's taken part. Just before you leave us, can I urge you please to like and subscribe the video that you're currently watching? Can I ask you to check out the IEA on Patreon? And I want to give huge thanks to these top-tier IEA online patrons: Andrew Hunt, Donald Blaney, James Burns, Mark Edwards, Philip Wazouf, Richard Leader, Robert Appleby and Timothy Worrell. And if you'd like to find more about our Patreon account, please go to patreon.com/IEA London. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Alex Dean. This has been Live Without Littlewood.